Snoop Dogg disguises himself as a homeless person to test the police. What happens next is crazy. Snoop Dogg disguised as a homeless man exposes shocking police bias in Central Park. Watch the jaw-dropping encounter that's shaking the system. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this bold experiment in social justice. The park was quiet that afternoon save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant hum of city traffic. Snoop sat on a weathered blue bench near the fountain, his hood pulled low over his face, his coat patched and frayed at the edges, looking like it hadn't seen a washing machine. In years, a brown paper bag rested beside him, crumpled and stained, and his sneakers mismatched and worn peeked out beneath the hem of his jeans. He didn't look up when a police cruiser slowly rolled into the park's parking lot. Officers stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel. As they surveyed the scene, one of them, a younger officer with a buzz cut and a badge it had gleamed in the afternoon sun, adjusted his belt. As she exchanged a glance with his partner, another officer, a stocky man, named Officer Higgins in his 40s, with a tired expression and a coffeeist. "Ain't a uniform," another vagrant, the younger officer, Officer Martinez, muttered, nodding towards Snoop on the bench. "This park is turning into a homeless camp. Let's just see what he's up to," Officer Higgins said, his voice lacking conviction. "Maybe he's harmless." The two officers approached the bench, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. Snoop didn't react, his gaze fixed on the ground as if he hadn't noticed them. "You can't sit there all day," Officer Martinez said sharply, his tone clipped. "This is a public park, not your living room." Snoop finally looked up, his eyes partial, hidden under the shadow of his hood. He said nothing, his expression unreadable, and reached into the paper bag beside him. Officer Martinez tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his hip. "Busy," Officer Higgins murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "Let's no escalate this." Snoop pulled out as in which was wrapped in wax paper, and began unwrapping it slowly, his movements deliberate but not threatening. He took a bite, chewing quietly, as if the officers weren't even here. "Did you hear me?" Officer Martinez snapped, stepping closer. "I said you can't sit there all day. You got somewhere to go?" Snoop swallowed his bite, his gaze flicking to the officer briefly before returning to his sandwich. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Just eating my lunch." "That's not the point," Officer Martinez shot back, his tone growing harsher. "People like you make the place look bad. You scare off families, tourists." Officer Higgins sighed again, crossing his arms as she watched the exchange. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice gruff but less aggressive than his partner. Snoop hesitated, his fingers tightening sly. "Tliant the sandwich." "Calvin," he said finally. "Calvin brought us." Officer Martinez smirked, clearly unimpressed. "Calvin brought us shoe you or apper in your spare time." Snoop didn't respond, his expression remaining neutral as she took another bite of his sandwich. His silences seemed to irritate Officer Martinez further, and he stepped closer, looming over the seated figure. "Let me see some ID," had demanded. Snoop set this sandwich down carefully, reaching into the pocket of his coat, had pulled out a worn leather wallet and handed it to Officer Martinez, who flipped it open with a practiced motion. The ID inside looked legitimate, though it bore no semblance to Snoop's current disheveled appearance. Officer Martinez frowned, scrutinizing the ID before handing it back. "What are you doing here?" "Brochest, why aren't you at a shelter or something?" "I like the fresh air," Snoop replied simply. "Is that a crime?" Officer Higgins shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner. "He's not doing anything illegal," he said quietly. "We can't just kick him out." "Maybe not," Officer Martinez muttered, his eyes narrowing, "but we can make it uncomfortable for him." Snoop's jaw tightened slightly, but it didn't respond. Instead, he picked up his sandwich, again taking another slow, deliberate bite. The tension between him and the officers crackled in the air, drawing the attention of a few passers-by who slowed their steps, their curiosity piqued. A woman walking her dog called out, "He's Hanley." He's not hurting anyone. Why are you bothering him, Officer Martinez turned toward her, his face hardening. Ma'am, this is none of your concern. This is a public park. It's also his right to be here, as much as anyone else, the woman shot back. Officer Higgins stepped in, raising a pleading hand. Mom, we're just doing our job. Please move along. The woman hesitated, her grip tightening on her dog's leash as she glanced between Snoop on the bench and the officers. Finally, she shook her head and continued walking, muttering something under her breath. Snoop watched her go, flicker of something, amusement, annoyance passing across his face. He's the sandwich down again, brushing crumbs from his lap. Ham. If free to go, hissed, his tone calm but with a subtle edge. You're not under arrest, Officer Higgins said, though his partner shot a warning glance. But you might want to find somewhere else to sit. Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Officer Martinez for a moment longer than necessary. Then he stood, picking up his paper bag and tucking it under his arm. He was taller than either of the officers had realized, and as he adjusted the hood of his coat, a lock of dark hair fell across his forehead. Have a nice day, he said. His voice low but pointed. Officer Martinez watched him go, his expression darkening. You see the way he looked at me, he muttered to his partner. Guy thinks she's better than us. Let if Sir Higgins replied warily, he's not worth the paperwork. As Snoop walked away, his steps slow and measured, the tension in the park began to ease. But something lingered in the air, an unspoken challenge, a spark of defiance. Officer Martinez's hand twitched on his baton, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at Snoop. The tension between them was palpable, like a live wire ready to spark. Snoop, however, remained unfazed, his calm demeanor only fueling Martinez's suspicion. Prove it, Martinez repeated, his voice low and edged with authority. Snoop sighed, almost imperceptibly, and reached for the paper bag beside him. He opened it slowly, revealing a neatly wrapped sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of water. He held it up for the officers to see, his expression unreadable. Satisfied, he asked, his tone even, but with a hint of something darker beneath the surface. Martinez's jaw tightened, his eyes darting from the bag to Snoop's face. That doesn't prove anything, he muttered, though his partner Higgins groaned audibly. For crying out loud, Martinez, Higgins said, throwing his hands up. It's a sandwich. Let it go. We've got real work to do. But Martinez wasn't convinced. He took another step closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Why are you really here? He demanded, his voice rising. You don't look like the kind of guy who just hangs out in parks eating lunch. Snoop's lips curved into that faint, knowing smile again, the one that made Martinez's skin crawl. Maybe I just like the scenery, he said, his gaze drifting past the officers to the trees beyond. Or maybe I'm waiting for someone. Either way, it's none of your business. Higgins grabbed Martinez by the arm, pulling him back. That's it, he said firmly. We're done here. You're making a scene over nothing. Martinez shook off his partner's grip but didn't move closer. He pointed a finger at Snoop, his voice low and threatening. I've got my eye on you. One wrong move, and I'll be all over you. Snoop didn't respond, his expression as calm as ever. He simply leaned back on the bench, his gaze returning to the sky as if the officers were no longer there. Higgins dragged Martinez back toward the cruiser, muttering under his breath. You're gonna get us both written up if you keep this up. Let it go, man. Martinez climbed into the passenger seat, his eyes still locked on Snoop through the windshield. There's something off about him, he said again, more to himself than to Higgins. I can feel it. Higgins started the engine, shaking his head. You've been watching too many crime shows. Not every guy in a park is a criminal, you know. As the cruiser pulled away, Snoop's smile widened slightly. He reached into the paper bag, pulling out the sandwich and unwrapping it slowly. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully as he watched the cruiser disappear down the path. The park was quiet again, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But the calm was short-lived. A few minutes later, a figure emerged from the trees, dressed in a dark hoodie and jeans. He walked with purpose, his eyes scanning the area before settling on Snoop. "Took you long enough," Snoop said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the newcomer. The man sat down on the bench, keeping a few feet of distance between them. "Had to make sure you weren't followed," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. Snoop nodded, his expression serious now. "You got it?" The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, sleek USB drive. He handed it to Snoop, who examined it briefly before tucking it into his jacket. "This better be worth it," Snoop said, his tone hardening. "I've had enough heat for one day." The man smirked, leaning back on the bench. "Relax. It's all there. Everything you need to bring them down." Snoop's eyes narrowed, his mind already racing with the possibilities. "Good. Then it's time to make our move." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their plans hanging heavy in the air. Finally, the man stood, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Be careful," he said, his tone serious. "They're watching you closer than you think." Snoop nodded, his gaze distant. "I know, but they're not the only ones watching." As the man disappeared into the trees, Snoop leaned back on the bench, his mind already working through the next steps. The game was far from over, and he intended to come out on top. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez sat in the cruiser, his fingers drumming restlessly on the dashboard. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to go down, and he was determined to be ready when it did. "We're not done," he muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he stared out at the road ahead. Not by a long shot. The tension in the air was thick, the calm before the storm. And somewhere in the heart of the city, the pieces were already in motion, setting the stage for a showdown that would change everything. Officer Martinez stopped a few feet from the bench, his eyes locked on Snoop, who sat there as if he hadn't a care in the world. The younger officer's jaw was tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He wasn't just suspicious now. He was angry. Angry at the calmness, the defiance, the way this man seemed to be toying with him. "You're still here," Martinez said, his voice low and sharp. "Most people would have moved on by now, found somewhere else to sit, somewhere less noticeable." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanging. "I like this bench," he replied simply. "Good view. Quiet. Why would I leave?" Martinez took a step closer, his hand twitching near his baton. "You think you're funny, don't you? Sitting here, acting like you're above it all. But I know there's something you're not telling me, and I'm going to find out what it is." Officer Higgins, who had been standing a few feet back, sighed heavily. "Martinez, come on. We've been over this. He's not doing anything wrong. Let's just move on." But Martinez wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Snoop, his instincts screaming that there was more to this man than met the eye. "You're hiding something," he said, his voice rising slightly. "And I'm not leaving until I figure out what it is." Snoop leaned back on the bench, his hands resting casually on his knees. "You've already searched me, searched my bag, found nothing. "So what's the problem, officer? You don't like being wrong?" Martinez's face flushed with anger, and for a moment it looked like he might lose his composure. But then he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "and I'm not the kind of guy who likes to lose." Snoop's lips curved into a faint smile, but he said nothing. The tension between them was palpable, like a storm brewing just beneath the surface. Nearby, a group of tourists paused to take photos, their laughter a stark contrast to the intensity of the moment. Officer Higgins stepped forward, placing a hand on Martinez's shoulder. "That's enough," he said firmly. "We're done here. Let's go." Martinez hesitated, his eyes still locked on Snoop, but then he nodded reluctantly, stepping back. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not by a long shot." As the two officers turned and walked back to their cruiser, Snoop watched them go, his expression unreadable. He reached into the paper bag beside him, pulling out the bottle of water and taking a slow sip. His gaze flicked briefly toward the cluster of trees nearby, where the man in the gray hoodie had been standing earlier. But the man was gone now, vanished into the shadows. Snoop set the water bottle down, his movements calm and deliberate. He knew Martinez would be back. He could feel it. The younger officer was too stubborn, too determined to let this go. And that was exactly what Snoop was counting on. As the cruiser disappeared around the corner, Snoop leaned back on the bench, his eyes scanning the park around him. The joggers, the tourists, the families enjoying the afternoon, they were all part of the backdrop, the perfect cover for what was really going on. And Snoop was at the center of it all, a quiet force pulling the strings. A few minutes passed, and then the man in the gray hoodie reappeared, slipping out from behind a tree and approaching the bench. He kept his distance, his hands tucked into his pockets, his eyes darting around nervously. "They're gone," he said, his voice low. "For now." Snoop nodded, his gaze still fixed on the path ahead. "They'll be back," he said. "Martinez isn't the type to let this go." The man in the hoodie shifted uncomfortably. "You're pushing him too hard," he said. "If he figures out what's really going on—" "He won't," Snoop interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "Not if we stick to the plan." The man hesitated, his brow furrowed with worry. "I don't like this," he said. "It's too risky. If something goes wrong—" "It won't," Snoop said, cutting him off again. "I've got this under control." The man in the hoodie nodded reluctantly, but his unease was clear. He glanced over his shoulder, as if expecting Martinez to come charging back at any moment. "Just be careful," he said. "You're playing with fire." Snoop didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew the risks, and he knew what was at stake. But he also knew that sometimes you had to play with fire to get what you wanted. As the man in the hoodie slipped away, disappearing into the trees once more, Snoop reached into the paper bag and pulled out the apple. He took a bite, chewing slowly as he watched the park around him. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked and a child laughed. It was a peaceful scene, but Snoop knew better. Peace was just an illusion, a temporary reprieve from the chaos that was always lurking just beneath the surface. And he was right in the middle of it, a quiet storm waiting to break. He didn't have to wait long. The familiar hum of the police cruiser reached his ears again, growing louder as it approached. Snoop didn't move. His posture relaxed, his expression calm, but his eyes were sharp, focused, ready for whatever came next. Officer Martinez was out of the car before it had fully come to a stop, his steps quick and purposeful as he approached the bench. His older partner followed at a slower pace, his expression one of mounting frustration. "We need to talk," Martinez said, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "And this time, you're going to tell me the truth." Snoop looked up at him, his gaze steady. "I've already told you the truth," he said, "but if you want to hear it again, I'm happy to oblige." Martinez's jaw tightened, and for a moment, it looked like he might snap. But then he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't a game," he said, "and I'm not going to stop until I figure out what you're hiding." Snoop leaned back on the bench, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Then I guess we'll be seeing a lot more of each other," he said, "because I'm not going anywhere." The tension between them was electric, a silent battle of wills that neither was willing to back down from. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in shadows, it was clear that this was only the beginning. Martinez's jaw tightened as he took another step towards Snoop, his hand still resting on his baton. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low and tense. "You think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us. I don't think so. You're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression still calm, though there was a faint glimmer of amusement in his eyes. "Officer," he said evenly, "if I'm hiding something, it's not because I'm trying to outsmart you. Maybe I just enjoy the peace and quiet of this park. Ever think of that?" Officer Higgins sighed, rubbing his temple again. "Martinez, this is getting out of hand. We've got no reason to keep pushing this. Let it go." But Martinez wasn't listening. His frustration had reached a boiling point, and he wasn't about to back down. "No," he snapped, his voice rising. "This guy's playing games, and I'm not about to let him walk away like he's won. If he's got nothing to hide, he won't mind answering a few more questions." Snoop leaned back on the bench, folding his arms across his chest. "Ask away," he said, his tone almost bored. "But I think we both know you're not going to like the answers." Martinez's eyes narrowed. "Why are you really here? And don't give me that enjoying the view crap. People don't just sit around in parks for hours unless they're up to something." Snoop shrugged. "Maybe I'm waiting for someone. Maybe I'm just enjoying the fresh air. Or maybe," he added, his voice dropping slightly, "I'm here to remind you that not everyone fits into your little box of what's normal." Officer Higgins stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Martinez, that's enough. We're done here. Let's go." But Martinez wasn't ready to let it go. He reached for his radio again, his thumb pressing the button as he spoke. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a full background check on Calvin Broadus. Run it through every database you've got. I want to know everything about this guy." The radio crackled and the dispatcher's voice came through faintly. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression still unreadable. "You're really determined, aren't you?" he said, his tone almost teasing. "I'm starting to feel special." Martinez glared at him, his hand tightening on the radio. "Don't flatter yourself. If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to worry about." Officer Higgins groaned, throwing up his hands in exasperation. This is ridiculous. You're turning this into something it's not. Let's go before you make this worse." But Martinez wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on Snoop, his suspicion only deepening. "I know you're hiding something," he muttered under his breath. "And I'm going to find out what it is." The radio crackled again, and the dispatcher's voice came through, this time with a hint of confusion. "Unit 12. We've run the name Calvin Broadus through every database. There's no record of anyone by that name. Either the ID you provided is fake, or there's an error in the system." Martinez's jaw tightened, and he shot a triumphant look at Snoop. "See, I told you, he's lying." Snoop, however, didn't seem fazed. He leaned back on the bench, his expression calm. "Or maybe your system's just outdated," he said, his tone almost casual. "Ever think of that?" Officer Higgins stepped in, his voice firm. "That's enough, Martinez. We're done here. Let's go." But Martinez wasn't ready to back down. He took another step toward Snoop, his hand resting on his baton. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low and tense. "But you're not as smart as you think you are. I'm going to find out what you're hiding, and when I do, you're going to regret messing with me." Snoop's gaze remained steady, though there was a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, in his eyes. "You're very determined," he said, his tone almost flattering. "It's almost impressive." Officer Higgins grabbed Martinez's arm, pulling him back toward the cruiser. "Let's go," he said sharply, "before you make this worse." Reluctantly, Martinez allowed himself to be led away, but his glare remained fixed on Snoop as they returned to the car. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, slamming the door behind him. Snoop watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable once again. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device that fit neatly into the palm of his hand. As he turned it over, a faint smirk crossed his lips. The game was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. The cruiser circled back to the parking lot, Martinez gripping the wheel tightly, his knuckles white as his frustration boiled over. "I know something's off with this guy," he muttered, his eyes flicking toward the park paths, scanning for Snoop. "He's not just some random guy. He's playing us, and I'm not about to let him get away with it." Officer Higgins sighed, his voice weary. "Let it go, Martinez. Not everyone's hiding something. Maybe the database just didn't update. Ever think of that?" Martinez shook his head, his jaw tight. "No. There's more to this. The way he talks, the way he moves. He's not just some random guy. He's playing us, and I'm not about to let him get away with it." Officer Higgins shot him a look. "Let him get away with what? Sitting on a bench, eating a sandwich? You're acting like he's some kind of mastermind." "He might be," Martinez muttered, pulling the car to a stop just near the cluster of trees where they'd last seen Snoop. Sure enough, he was still there, sitting calmly on the same bench as before. His hood was pushed back slightly now, revealing more of his face, though his posture remained relaxed, unbothered by their return. The paper bag beside him was now folded neatly, tucked against his leg as if to signal that he was finished eating. He looked up as the officers approached, his expression unreadable. "You boys miss me already?" he asked, his tone calm but with a faint hint of amusement. Martinez stiffened, his frustration bubbling over. "We're not done with you yet," he said sharply, stepping closer. "That ID you gave us, it doesn't exist. Care to explain?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied. Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there. Don't get smart with me, Martinez snapped. I know a fake when I see one. Officer Higgins stepped in, his tone more measured. We're giving you a chance to come clean, he said. If there's something you need to tell us, now's the time. Snoop leaned back slightly, his posture still relaxed as he studied the two officers. What exactly do you think I'm hiding? He asked, his tone curious. A secret identity? A criminal record? Or maybe a sinister plan to overthrow the local park bench economy? Officer Higgins pressed a hand to his temple, clearly exhausted by the exchange. Look, he said, you're not making this easier on yourself. If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, my partner's not going to let this go. I think we both know that's true. Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze flicking to Martinez. You've made up your mind about me, haven't you? He said. Nothing I say is going to change that. Martinez stepped closer, his hand resting on his baton. You think you're clever, he said, his voice low and tense. You think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us. I don't think so. You're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is. Snoop's smirk widened slightly, though his expression remained calm. Well, officer, he said, his tone almost playful. I guess we'll just have to see how this plays out, won't we? As the tension between them grew, the park around them seemed to grow quieter, as if holding its breath. The game was far from over, and Snoop knew it. But for now, he was content to sit back and watch as the pieces fell into place. Officer Martinez stood frozen, his mind racing as the weight of Snoop's words sank in. The crowd outside Central Park was growing larger by the second, their murmurs rising into a cacophony of curiosity and judgment. News cameras were now trained on him, their lenses capturing every flicker of emotion on his face. He felt exposed, cornered, and utterly powerless. You think you're clever, don't you? Martinez spat, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. You think this little stunt makes you some kind of hero? You're just a con artist, playing games with people's lives. Snoop's expression remained unshaken, his calm demeanor only amplifying Martinez's frustration. I'm not here to be a hero, Snoop replied evenly. I'm here to shine a light on what's been in the shadows for too long. People like you, Officer Martinez, who abuse their power, who think the badge gives them the right to intimidate and harass, they need to be held accountable. Martinez's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't know anything about me, he growled. You don't know what it's like to do this job, to deal with people like you every day. You're right, Snoop said, his tone softening just enough to catch Martinez off guard. I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes, but I do know what it's like to be on the other side of that badge. And today, millions of people got to see what that feels like too. The officer's eyes darted to the crowd, then back to Snoop. He could feel the weight of their stares, the judgment in their whispers. His chest tightened, and for a moment he considered walking away, retreating to the safety of his cruiser. But pride, or perhaps desperation, kept him rooted to the spot. This isn't over, Martinez said, his voice low but trembling with barely contained rage. You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll find a way to make this right. Snoop tilted his head, his faint smile returning. Make it right for who? For yourself, or for the people you've sworn to protect? Because right now, it doesn't look like you've been doing much protecting. Martinez opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. His mind was a whirlwind of anger, fear, and regret. He wanted to lash out, to prove that he wasn't the villain Snoop was making him out to be. But deep down, he knew the truth. The footage didn't lie. His actions had spoken for themselves. As the silence stretched between them, Snoop reached into his coat pocket once more. Martinez tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his baton. But instead of a weapon, Snoop pulled out a small business card. He held it out, his gaze steady. "If you're serious about making things right," Snoop said, "call this number. There are people who can help you understand why this happened and how you can do better. But it's up to you to take that step." Martinez stared at the card, his pride warring with the small, nagging voice in the back of his mind that told him he needed this. After a long moment, he snatched the card from Snoop's hand, shoving it into his pocket without looking at it. "This isn't over," he repeated, though the words lacked their earlier fire. He turned on his heel and strode toward the edge of the park, the crowd parting reluctantly to let him through. The cameras followed him, their lenses capturing his retreat like a predator tracking wounded prey. Snoop watched him go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end, not for Martinez, and not for the larger issues this experiment had exposed. But it was a start, and sometimes that was enough. As the crowd began to disperse, Snoop turned and walked deeper into the park, his hands tucked into his pockets. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a street performer began to play a soulful tune on a saxophone, the notes drifting through the air like a bittersweet reminder of the day's events. Snoop paused for a moment, listening. Then, with a small nod to himself, he continued on his way. The game wasn't over, but for now, he had made his point. And the world was watching. Was a mask of panic and rage as the weight of the situation bore down on him. His eyes darted to the growing crowd of bystanders, their phones raised and recording, and then to the approaching news crews who were eagerly documenting every second. The sudden realization that he had gone from an authority figure to a public spectacle was suffocating. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat, pointing an accusatory finger at Snoop dressing up and playing games. "You're nothing but a fraud." Snoop didn't flinch, his calm demeanor remained intact. "Even as Officer Martinez's words echoed across Central Park, "This isn't about me," Snoop said, his voice measured but firm. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in positions of power choose to treat those think are powerless." "Powerless, Officer Martinez," barked, his voice rising in desperation. "You're Snoop Dogg, for God's sake, you're a celebrity. Don't act like you're some saint coming down from the heavens." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression unmoved. "Exactly," he said, "and yet you treated me like dirt the moment you assumed I was homeless. Imagine how you treat people who don't." The Vether sources to fight back. Officer Higgins arrived on the scene, his face pale as she took in the chaos she'd been following in the cruiser, but hadn't anticipated the scale of what was unfolding. He grabbed Officer Martinez by the arm, pulling him back as she whispered urgently, "Stop talking. You're making it worse." "I'm not going to let them get away with this," Officer Martinez shot back, his voice trembling with anger. But his partner's grip tightened, And the warning in his eyes finally registered. "You already did," Officer Higgins said quietly, his tone heavy with resignation. "Just stop before you dig the hole any deeper." The crowd murmured, their voices a mix of disbelief and indignation. Words like abuse of power and disgrace rippled through the gathering, the condemnation growing louder with each passing moment. The news crews were now fully set up, their cameras zoomed in on the confrontation. Reporters were speaking animatedly into their microphones. Their broadcast lived to millions. Snoop turned his attention to the crowd, addressing them with the same calm authority he'd shown throughout the day. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said. "It's about a sister that allows this kind of behavior to checked it. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions but for their attitudes." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound reverberating through Central Park. Officer Martinez's face flushed red, his humiliation complete as sterilized. There was now a way to regain control of the narrative. He glanced at the cameras, the realization dawning that his every move was being broadcast to the world. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I was just doing my job. Your job is to serve and protect." Snoop said, his gaze's heart not profile harass or abuse your authority. "And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't worth a badge of officer." Higgins stepped in again, his tone now pleading. "Let him go," he said. "We need to leave." But before they could retreat, another voice cut through the chaos, a commanding voice that silenced the crowd officers. "Stand down." Everyone turned to see a woman in a crisp suit approaching her presence, exuding authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how to take control of a situation. The badge clipped to her belt identified her as Captain Jane Monroe from the Internal Affairs Division of the NYPD. Officer Martinez's eyes widened as she approached, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "You've made quite a mess," she said, her tone cold. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences, ma'am." "I have began," but she held up a hand to silence him. "Save it," he said. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public's made their opinion pretty clear." She gestured to the crowd, who were now openly booing Officer Martinez. Captain Monroe turned to Snoop, her demeanor softening slightly. "Mr. Dogg," she said on behalf of the department, "I'd like to apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Snoop nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The woman nodded, turning back to Officer Martinez. "Hand over your badge." "And weeping," she said, hurt and leaving no room for argument. "What?" Officer Martinez stammered, his face pale. "You can't be serious." "Do it," she snapped. "You're on administrative leave pending an investigation. And trust me, this investigation will be thorough." Officer Martinez's hands trembled as she unclipped his badge and gun, handing the mover with a look of utter defeat. The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices a mixture of triumph and relief, as justice began to take shape. As Officer Martinez was led away, his shoulders slung, Snoop turned to the camera. "So on last T, Methis isn't the end," he said. "It's just the beginning. If we want to create real change, we need to hold people accountable. Not just when they're caught, but every single day." The crowd roared their approval, their applause echoing through Central Park as the weight of the moment settled over everyone present. Officer Martinez, now stripped of his authority, was escorted away, his humiliation complete. The news crews lingered, some still capturing shots off the park bench where the day's event had unfolded. Snoop remained standing near the fountain, his hands stuck casually into the pockets of his coat. His thought this were just another ordinary day. Captain Monroe returned to him, her expression still one of professional seriousness. "Miss Dogg," she began, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior." Snoop nodded but didn't smile. I hope so, he replied, because it's not about one officer. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen. She hesitated, clearly unsettled by the weight of his words. I understand, she said finally, and I'll make sure your concerns are heard. As she walked away, Snoop turned back to the bench, the faintest trace of a smile playing on his lips. She sat down again, pulling his phone and scrolling through the live stream comments. They were pouring in by the thousand, expressions of outrageous support and shock at what had unfolded. This is exactly why we need accountability, one comment read. Snoop Dogg just exposed a huge problem. Another said, this isn't just about one cop, it's about the whole system. Another commenter pointed out Snoop's smile widened slightly. As she typed, our response changes starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going. Mrs. Patel, an elderly woman who had been watching everything from the sidelines, approached him cautiously. I had no idea who you were, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But what you did is brave. You didn't have to do that. Snoop looked up, his expression softening. Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand. Dan, sometimes the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it. He nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. Well, thank you, she said, for standing up for all the people who can't. He nodded back, watching. As she walked away, nearby, the officers who remained on the scene were speaking with their superiors. Their postures ceased. They awaited instructions. Officer Martinez, now stripped of his badge and weapons, sat in the back of another cruiser, his head in his hand. His career, if not his entire life, was in ruins, and the weight of his actions hung heavily over him. Capt. Ain Monroe had already begun reviewing the live footage with a team of investigators. Their expressions grimaced. They pieced together the chain of events for Snoop. This was just the beginning of a larger effort to address systemic issues. He had no intention of letting this moment pass without action. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Central Park, Snoop stood and stretched. The quiet hum of a sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb drew his attention, and he smiled faintly as a young assistant stepped out, holding the door open. Ready to go, sir? The assistant asked. Not just yet, Snoop replied, his gaze weeping over Central Park. On last time he turned back to the bench, pulling out a pen and a scrap of paper from his pockets. Scribbling something quickly, he folded the note and tucked it under the edge of the bench. The assistant looked puzzled but didn't ask questions as Snoop finally approached the car. Before stepping in, he glanced back at the crowd, the officers, and the bench where it had all started. This isn't just about me, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table or the bench. As the SUV glided away, the note left behind on the bench fluttered slightly in the breeze. It read, to the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The crowd began to thin, but the conversation didn't stop. People spoke about what they'd seen, about the abuses of power, and about the unexpected courage of a man who chose to challenge the system from a park bench. The day would live on, not just in the news, but in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. And for Snoop Dogg, the work was far from over. This was just one park, one officer, one moment. But every big change started with a small spark, and as she leaned back in the SUV, scrolling through the thousands of comments pouring into his live stream, he knew one thing for certain: the spark had been lit. The moral of the story was clear: power, whether given by authority or wealth, comes with responsibility, and it's only when we hold ourselves and others accountable that we can build a world where dignity and respect are afforded to everyone, no matter where they sit. As the news of Snoop Dogg's social experiment spread, the video of the confrontation became a viral sensation, sparking debates across social media, news outlets, and communities worldwide. People were divided. Some praised its bold approach to exposing systemic issues, while others questioned the ethics of the experiment. But one thing was clear: the conversation about accountability and law enforcement and societal biases had been reignited. Back in Central Park, life slowly returned to normal. Thought the bench where Snoop had sat became something of a landmark. Visitors stopped to take photos, some leaving notes of their own, inspired by the words Snoop had left behind. Your story matters, don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The simple message resonated deeply, particularly with those who had faced discrimination or felt powerless in the face of authority. For Officer Martinez, the fallout was immediate and severe. Stripped of his badge and weapon, he faced a public investigation into his conduct, his actions condemned by both his superiors and the public. His partner, Officer Higgins, though spared disciplinary action, carried the heavy burden of witnessing how quickly unchecked bias could escalate into something far worse. He resolved to be more vigilant in his duties, vowing to ensure that such incidents wouldn't happen again on his watch. Meanwhile, Snoop returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose. At a press conference days later in Times Square, he addressed the incident directly. This wasn't about embarrassing anyone, he said. It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society.